Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today, we continue following the story of Hoài Ca and Hùng, a story that is not only about debt, but also about the very real struggles of family bonds, responsibility, and the painful choices adults are forced to make. In the previous episode, Hùng and Hoài Ca reached the most tense period since they decided to live together. The debt of over 100 million that Hung's mother borrowed from loan sharks not only failed to decrease, but continued to grow larger each day as interest piled upon interest. At first, it was just a shocking number on paper, but over time, it turned into a dark shadow that clung to their lives, leaving them unable to breathe easily for even a single moment. Hùng, believing he could not let his mother face danger alone, stepped forward to take responsibility for the debt. What seemed like a son's sense of duty ended up turning him into the direct target of the debt collectors. His phone was almost never silent. Constant calls, short messages filled with threats, came day and night. They even began lingering near his workplace, watching from a distance, more than enough to let him know he was being monitored. The pressure didn't stop there. Once the debt collectors learned that Hùng was living with Hoài Ca, they began targeting her as well. Each time Hoài Ca stepped out of the house, she felt unfamiliar eyes following her. Casual-sounding questions laced with intimidation sent chills down her spine. She had never been used to confrontations like this, but for Hung's sake, she forced herself to be stronger than she truly felt. During countless sleepless nights, Hùng and Hoài Ca sat facing each other in what used to be a peaceful home, now a space heavy with suffocating tension. They discussed every possible option. Selling Hoài Ca's house, her most valuable asset, a place tied to years of memories and effort. Then they thought about Hung's mother's house, where she had spent nearly her entire life. Every option came with long stretches of silence, because they both understood that no matter which path they chose, someone would be deeply hurt. As this episode begins, the picture has not grown any brighter. On the contrary, witnessing firsthand how Hùng and Hoài Ca struggled to scrape together every bit of money, carefully calculating even the smallest expenses, Hung's mother became overwhelmed with guilt and remorse. Seeing her son exhausted after work, or noticing Hoài Ca quietly clutching her phone, anxious every time an unknown number appeared, felt like a tight grip around her heart. Hung's mother knew all too well that everything happening now stemmed from her own mistakes. She was the one who signed the loan papers, the one who believed the easy promises, and the one who failed to foresee the consequences. Now that everything had spiraled out of control, the burden was no longer hers alone. Her son and the small family Hùng was desperately trying to protect were paying the price as well. Guilt clung to her day after day. There were nights when she barely slept, sitting silently and staring into the empty space, asking herself how she had let things come to this. She wanted to do something, no matter how small, to ease the burden on Hùng and Hoài Ca. But in her hands now, there was almost nothing left except regret. Unable to remain still any longer, Hung's mother began thinking about the people around her, old connections she once had, however faint the hope might be. Eventually, one name surfaced in her mind: Tusan. From what she knew, Tusan was a kind-hearted woman who had helped many people in difficult times. Though she wasn't sure how much Tusan could help, it felt like the only option she could think of. And so, on an unannounced morning, Hung's mother quietly went to find Tusan. Without drawing attention, without telling anyone, she carried the heavy weight of worry in her heart, along with a small flicker of hope that perhaps here she might find a way out, or at least a moment of understanding and compassion for the suffocating days that Hùng and Hoài Ca were enduring. When she finally met Tusan, Hung's mother could no longer maintain her usual composure. The moment she sat down, She lowered her head deeply, her hands clasped tightly together, trembling as if she were trying to hold back emotions that had been bottled up for far too long. It took a while before she could speak. When she did, her voice was choked and broken, stopping several times before she could continue. Slowly, she talked about the initial loan, about the early days when she believed she could manage it within a short period of time, until the interest quietly accumulated day after day, week after week, turning the debt into a burden far beyond her control. At certain moments, Hung's mother spoke very slowly, as if each word required every ounce of courage she had left. At other times, she broke down in tears, unable to wipe them away in time, because even she could not believe how far things had spiraled. She admitted her mistakes openly, without excuses, without shifting blame. She confessed that she was wrong to trust so easily, wrong to think that effort alone would be enough, and wrong to ignore the long-term consequences. Now, what hurt her the most was not her pride or the judgment of others, but the fact that her son and Hoài Ca were forced to face dangers they never should have had to endure. When she spoke about Hung, her voice fell noticeably lower. She talked about seeing her son exhausted day after day, about Hoài Ca's anxious eyes whenever an unknown number appeared on the phone, and about the crushing helplessness of knowing that everything stemmed from her own decision. In the end, Hung's mother bowed deeply, her voice trembling as she asked if she could borrow some money from Tusan. She knew very well that she was placing Tusan in a difficult position, and even more so that this was not an easy request to make. She did not dare to mention a large amount, only hoping to borrow a little, just enough to get through the immediate crisis, just enough to ease the pressure weighing on Hung and Hoài Ca day after day. In her eyes at that moment was a mixture of shame and despair, the look of a mother who had reached the end of her road, with no other choice but to ask for help from someone outside her family, no matter how painful it was. Tusan sat across from her, listening quietly to every word. She did not interrupt or press with questions, allowing the story to unfold completely. Each sentence felt like a cut to her heart. Tusan understood the situation Hung's family was in, and she knew that this debt was not merely about money, but about very real and dangerous risks. Yet when faced with the reality of her own financial limits, she felt a helplessness just as deep. She simply did not have such a large sum of money. Her life had already been carefully planned, and what little she had saved was only enough for her own unfinished plans. Realizing this made Tusan's heart sink. She worried about Hung and Hoài Ca, worried about Hung's mother, but at the same time felt sorrowful knowing she could not help immediately as she wished. That inner conflict kept her silent for a long while, her gaze lowered, as if she were quietly blaming herself. Eventually, Tusan refused to let the silence stretch on any longer. She reached out, gently holding Hung's mother's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. Her voice softened, slow but sincere. Tusan said she was truly sorry that she could not offer an immediate solution, and that she could not promise anything for certain. But she assured her that she would try within her means, that she would think, ask around, and not leave Hung's family to face this alone. The promise was neither grand nor absolute, but it was enough for Hung's mother to feel a sense of comfort in her near despair. That day, when Tusan returned home, she carried with her an exhaustion and heaviness that were hard to put into words. She took off her shoes, set her bag down, and sat motionless on the chair. She did not turn on the lights right away, allowing the room to remain dim in the fading afternoon light. In that quiet space, Hung's mother's words replayed over and over in her mind, intertwined with images of Hung and Hoài Ca struggling to count every coin, every small expense. Tusan picked up her phone, then put it back down, unsure whom to call or where to begin. She sat there for a long time, unaware of time passing. The anxiety pressed heavily on her chest, her thoughts tangled in a cycle with no clear way out. Just then, Hai, her boyfriend, came to visit. The moment he walked in, he noticed that Tusan was different from usual. Her familiar brightness was gone, her face showed clear exhaustion, and her eyes were heavy, as if burdened with unspoken thoughts. Hai did not ask right away. He simply sat beside her quietly, leaving just enough space, waiting for her to speak on her own. That silence unexpectedly soothed Tusan a little. After a while, Hai asked gently, his voice calm and unhurried, carrying no curiosity, only concern. At first, Tusan hesitated. She did not want to pull Hai into troubles that were not his, nor did she want to add to his worries with such heavy matters. But the longer she stayed silent, the more uncomfortable she felt. In the end, Tusan decided to tell him everything. She spoke about Hung's mother's debt, about Hung taking responsibility in her place, about the debt collectors constantly calling, following them, and even targeting Hoai Ca. She also talked about the sleepless nights when Hung and Hoai Ca were forced to consider selling their homes, a thought that caused everyone deep pain and hesitation. Hai listened from beginning to end without interrupting. His expression grew more serious as he grasped the severity of the situation. At times he lowered his head in thought, at others, he looked at Tusan for a long moment, clearly weighing many things at once. He understood that this was not a problem that could be solved with a few comforting words. He saw the extreme effort Hung and Hoai Ca were making, and the guilt Tusan carried for being unable to help those she cared about. After a long stretch of silence, Hai stood up and walked toward the table, opening a drawer. The action surprised Tusan slightly, but she did not ask. When Hai returned, he held a prepared sum of money in his hands. He placed it on the table in front of her, his voice firm but not heavy. Hai said that he wanted Tusan to give this 50 million to Hung as his contribution to the amount the family had been struggling to gather all this time. Tusan stared at the money before her, feeling a mix of shock, emotion, and deep concern. She knew that 50 million was not a small amount, and that Hai's decision was far from simple. She fell silent, her eyes still fixed on the money on the table, trying to organize the surge of emotions flooding her all at once, before facing whatever might come next. When Hung heard Tusan talk about that money, he was almost frozen in place. For the first few seconds, he didn't react at all. He just stood there, his eyes filled with disbelief, as if what he had just heard couldn't possibly be real. 50 million, the missing amount that he and Hoai Ca had struggled to scrape together for so many days, had suddenly appeared in a way he had never dared to imagine. His heart pounded hard as a flood of emotions rushed through him, relief, deep gratitude, and a sharp sense of guilt, knowing this was far from a small or simple act of help. Hung had to ask again, his voice low and hoarse, as if he needed reassurance that he hadn't misheard. When Tusan nodded in confirmation, he finally began to accept that it was real. That money was the final piece, the way out of the deadlock his family had been trapped in. In that moment, it felt as though the heavy weight pressing on his shoulders for so many days suddenly eased, even though his heart still couldn't fully settle. Hoai Ca stood beside him, her eyes red and glassy. She couldn't say much, only lowered her head quietly, her trembling hands clasped tightly together. Over the past days, she had lived under constant anxiety. Every unknown call made her heart seize. Every night felt unbearably long. Now, knowing that the debt could finally be resolved, a wave of relief washed over her so strongly that she nearly broke into tears. She looked at Hai with deep gratitude, not only for the money, but because he appeared at exactly the moment when everything seemed to have reached its breaking point. Hung and Hoai Ca kept thanking him. Their words of gratitude were anything but empty. They came straight from the depths of their hearts. To them, this help was not just about money. It was a hand pulling them back from the edge, a source of strength at a moment when they felt they could no longer endure. Hung knew all too clearly that without Hai's timely presence, he had no idea what his family might have been forced to face next. Because of that money, Hung no longer had to make the decision to sell the house, a decision that had kept him awake night after night. To him and Hoai Ca, the house was not merely an asset, but a place that held their hope for a stable life after so many upheavals. Once the debt was paid, the debt collectors temporarily withdrew. The constant calls, the threatening stares near his workplace, gradually disappeared. The atmosphere within the family changed noticeably, from suffocating tension to a quieter calm, even though the scars of those turbulent days could not fade away immediately. For the first time in a long while, Hoai Ca could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Only then did she realize just how deeply she had been living in fear. She knew there would still be many challenges ahead, but at least the immediate danger had been pushed back. She looked at Hung and saw the exhaustion etched clearly on his face, but also noticed the faint glimmer of relief he was trying to hide. When Hung's mother learned that the situation had been temporarily resolved, her heart felt lighter as well. She no longer had to live in constant fear that her son and daughter-in-law would be harmed because of her mistakes. Yet that sense of relief could not erase her remorse. She understood that even though the debt had been paid, the trouble she caused had left lasting marks on her children's lives. That realization made her more withdrawn, more contemplative about responsibility and the choices she had made. As for Hai, after this incident, he gradually earned more affection and respect from everyone in Hung's family. No one said much out loud, but the way they looked at him, the way they treated him, was different from before. Hai did not act proud or treat his help as something extraordinary. To him, it was simply what needed to be done when he saw people around him in hardship. Tusan looked at Hai with completely new eyes. It was no longer just the gaze of a woman in love, but one filled with deep gratitude and rare reassurance. She understood that the man standing before her didn't just love her in words, he was willing to stand beside her and shoulder heavy, complicated family problems, even when doing so was far from easy. Although Hai said he didn't expect Hung to repay the money, treating it as help in a time of crisis, Hung couldn't accept that so easily. To him, this money wasn't just a number. It was a debt of kindness, a goodwill that deserved to be honored. He firmly promised that he would work hard, save little by little, and repay it in full when he was able. It wasn't only about money, but about the pride of a man, and the way he preserved respect and balance in relationships with those who had stepped forward to help his family at their darkest moment. That promise was not spoken loudly, yet it carried a quiet determination. In Hung's eyes at that moment, there was not only gratitude, but also the resolve to stand on his own feet, to take responsibility himself, so that the kindness he had received would never turn into a burden on his conscience. Everything seemed to have finally settled down. After days of suffocating tension, once the last of the debt was resolved, the atmosphere in Hung's family gradually became quieter. The relentless phone calls no longer came, and the threatening, watchful eyes disappeared for the time being. On the surface, life appeared to return to its normal course, like a storm that had just passed, leaving behind a rare stretch of calm skies that everyone had longed for. Yet that quiet carried a very different feeling. It wasn't complete peace, but rather a pause, the kind of stillness that comes before something unnamed. Inside each person, the marks left by those turbulent days remained. Although Hung had managed to lift a heavy burden from his shoulders, deep down he still felt weary and exhausted, as if one small misstep could pull everything back into the same vicious cycle. Hoai Ca, despite feeling relieved, still couldn't fully relax. Fears that had built up day after day do not simply disappear overnight. As for Hung's mother, even though the immediate danger had passed, the biggest question continued to hang over her. After nearly pushing the entire family to the brink of collapse, would she truly change? Or would the guilt and remorse fade with time, slowly washed away by old habits and careless decisions? The mistakes she made had caused consequences too severe, and no one could be certain that a single shock like this was enough to ensure things would be different forever. Hai's help, though rooted in genuine kindness and goodwill, also left behind many thoughts and reflections. For Hung and Hoài Ca, it was an immense act of grace, a lifeline extended just as they were reaching their limit. But precisely because it came at such a critical moment, it also became something that invited deeper contemplation. Would that intervention bring nothing more than temporary relief, or might it lead to unforeseen changes in relationships, in how family members relate to one another, and how they perceive each other moving forward? Tusan, too, carried her own quiet concerns. She understood the value of Hai's help to Hung's family, yet she also sensed that when one major problem is resolved, others can quietly take shape beneath the surface. Some things cannot be measured in money, and some consequences do not appear immediately, revealing themselves only with time. Life, after everything, seemed to be entering a fragile phase. On the outside, there was calm, but beneath it lingered unanswered questions. Had the storm truly passed, or was it merely resting before another, stronger wind arrived? Would those involved learn lessons deep enough to avoid repeating past mistakes? And would the bond that had just been reinforced prove strong enough to withstand new challenges that could emerge at any moment? Everything remains uncertain. Stay tuned for the next episode to continue following the unfolding story of Hoài Ca and Hung.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel.
Cảm ơn mọi người đã theo dõi video của mình nhé. Tạm biệt.